So we have 3 flats in a 1960s building. It's cavity wall, it's got lots of metal support, and I understand there's concrete flooring, and obviously there's a flat roof. There's also, importantly, there's garages to the front, so you get a certain amount of heat loss down at the front. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take parts of the survey out and discuss them. So we're going to start with flat 12, and there's some brown patches at the top on the ceiling, and there's mould. Where you've got mould, you can either have a general issue with mould, so that's caused by excess vapour across the whole property, made worse by heat loss, or you can have localized mold. And in this case, I would say it's primarily localized, but made worse by general excess vapor, because the whole building is really badly ventilated. So I'm using a damp meter just to test to see whether the walls or the ceiling is dry. Actually, in this case, it was primarily dry. There was only a little bit. You can see I used a different type of damp meter, but there's a little bit of high moisture. It has red, but anything above below 300 is really dry. So there was some heat loss because of the bad insulation, and there's some dampness to the wall, but we'll talk about that later. But going up onto the roof, you can see that there's a bitumen felt roof that's been repaired, but it's constantly leaking, and I'm going to recommend looking at another video on this. There's also, it originally had ventilation, but the ventilation ducts have broken, or the fans are broken, and there's no replacement. Now I go into flat 1, and you can see from my glasses that it was high humidity, and it wasn't especially cold during that day. And looking through the thermal imaging camera, you can see all the zones of heat loss, but they're explanation for why you get damp in certain areas, but the root cause is the excess vapor. Notice the heat loss at the base of the wall. That's because of the because of the garage, the metal, but also condensation causes the water to dampen brick, which is a poor insulator. So there was dampness across the whole of that wall. There was a slight brown stain, which indicates water flowing through building material, but that's because it was forming on the base of the wall as well as on the wall itself, but on the floor, and causing the water to rise up. There was actual condensation at the time of the survey on a double glazed window unit. It was absolutely excess. And have a look at the data loggers at the end of the survey. You can see a lot more. This is in the bathroom. There's no extractor fan in the bathroom, and the doors are left open, and the window isn't closed. Now, going back into the room itself, you can see there's poor airflow around the beds. This traps the humid air against the wall, increasing the risk of dampness, and there's mold as well. And you get mold where you get high surface relative humidity, over 85% for long periods of time, and there are long periods of time. Now, they thought the cause was bitumen felt on the outside, but I don't think it had anything to do with it. Notice that you're getting brown staining at the top, and this is almost certainly because there's metal in supporting the ceiling, and you get rust coming through from the metal. So there are no signs of penetrating damp on the outside, and besides, it's the whole way across. Although I can't exclude penetrating damp because there's so much excess vapor, so much condensation, that has to be the primary cause. And you can see the dew point at the time of the survey was 13, and the outside temperature was something like 8 or 9. So going into flat 10, we got dampness on the wall there. Actually on the outside is a hopper, and I'd already seen it from before that, but there's a light brown staining indicating penetrating damp, because the water comes through a wall, it will bring colour with it from the brick. I'm using a very inexpensive damp meter, which I encourage anyone to buy. They cost about £23. It's called Dr. Meter, and it's a way of telling whether the wall is drying. I get the impression that this wall is actually drying out. The hopper on the outside had been cleared. It was blocked originally. It was cleared, so now there's far fewer issues with with water, rainwater. But I think what was happening is the rainwater was overflowing the back of the hopper and down the outside of the building. But have a look at that in a sec. The other thing in this property is there was very little ventilation. In fact, the whole building had very little ventilation. I think that's because there were crittle windows and probably hard to ventilate, and put ducting through cavity walls is much harder. But I think you have to explore different ways of ventilating the property, including the original ducting system, getting that working there again. Now, this is looking at the heat loss, and there are zones of heat loss in this property. Obviously, the damp wall is causing a zone of heat loss. There's also wall on the outside, and that's acting as a thermal fin, drawing heat out. The blue on the side is obviously the window. But also a damp wall is a poor insulator and causes heat loss. Also evaporation causes heat loss. So this is looking up at the damp wall, and you can see that from the moss that the moss is going all the way up to behind that fascia, which indicates that the water is actually flowing behind the fascia and down the wall rather than over the top of the hopper. So I spent some time up investigating it. Now, have a listen to my piece on data loggers, and you can see the conclusions from that and from the details below. Thank you for listening. I've already uploaded flat 1 and flat 10, but you can upload them by just pressing this button, but this is preloaded. At the time of the survey, the temperature in flat 1 was 12.3 degrees centigrade. If you look at the thermal imaging, flat 1 was 12.4 in fact, flat 10, 10.6, and flat 12, 9.5. But interestingly enough, the warmest flat was actually flat 1, and yet that had the greatest amount of condensation and mould. It was visible at the time of the survey, but you can see on this that so here the green line here is the surface relative humidity, and it's showing 100% the whole time, and that is because there was condensation taking place the whole time, and that is because this blue line here, the dew point line, is way too high. In fact, you should drop the dew point by increasing ventilation, dehumidification, but it should be below the outside temperature at all times. And where you have this sort of line where it's the vapor, the dew point, the amount of vapor in air is constantly up and down in line with temperature, that's because as you increase the temperature, you increase the evaporation from the wall, and then as the temperature drops, you're increasing the condensation in the wall. So you're removing the vapor by condensing in the wall as the temperature drops at night or whenever it is, and then during the day you're increasing the vapor by essentially evaporating out. If we look at this line here, this is the dew point differential, where in this case we're actually comparing it between two different properties, so that they don't have an effect on each other, but where you've got more vapor in one property compared to the other, it tells you that there's just way too little ventilation in that property compared to another, which was actually flat 10, and you can see that the dew point is almost 10 degrees higher than the above zero, which tells me that your walls would have to be about 10 degrees higher than in flat 10 in order to have the same amount of the same environment. We're going to have a look at flat 10 now, and there you can see that even in flat 10 there is actually still too much vapor. The temperature in flat 10 was is actually 10.2, I believe, 10.6. There you go, 10.6. And if we look at the comparison between the flat 10 relative humidity and I'll do it at, it was probably about 10, 11, 11:15 maybe. And it was on the 13th. Actually, it was probably more like 12:15. And here, so we can see is much lower surface relative humidity, but there are large periods when there's a risk of mold. And in fact, we could see mold growing around the property. If you have high surface relative humidity above 85% for more than 6 to 8 hours at a time, you have a risk of mold. But interestingly enough, I'll zoom in on different times, but that was during the survey. So this is when when we were calibrating the unit at 120. So I was just a bit before then. So you want to keep this blue line below the pink line by increasing ventilation and dehumidification. And I would encourage you and actually every property within the building to have mechanical vents in the bathroom and the kitchen. And I think that will solve most of the problems. But anyway, so you have penetrating damp, but there was mold elsewhere in the property, especially around the kitchen. This line here, the dew point differential, there isn't much difference because it's open plan. But when it's below the line, it's because there's more vapor coming from the source, which is the kitchen in this case. And these were been times when you were cooking, I imagine. So these spikes here, 8 p.m. And also when you've got coffee on the go, that sort of thing, those things will cause spikes. We're not seeing, if we zoom out, so I think it was raining around this period of time, and you can see the vapor levels going up, but that's also because the temperature's going up and the outside vapor is going up. But I wouldn't say that's particularly a sign of penetrating damp causing vapor. I think that's just because you get far less ventilation when you've got high vapor levels on the outside, because you're obviously having to blow a lot more air out in order to achieve the same degree of ventilation. So anyway, in summary, flat 10 has penetrating damp and some mold and condensation, or at least mold. Flat 12 likewise has past penetrating damp. I think both of them, the penetrating damp is by and large drying out, but it does take 6 to 10 months to dry out. Less for higher walls, but it still takes time to dry out. Flat 1 is definitely suffering from condensation, and I think there's some mold in flat 12, but that's probably localized from the penetrating damp to the roof.